This is Dr. Bryson with part 2 on the history of juvenile justice. In this video, we're going to pick up with English common law. Now, under English common law, children over 7 years old were treated no differently than adults when they committed a crime. I mean, imagine an 8-year-old who might commit a crime, the same crime that, say, a 35-year-old commits. They're going to receive the same punishment. But when we get into the 1600s, England begins to establish places like orphanages and workhouses, training schools and apprenticeships. Now, these were forms of slavery and involuntary servitude, and most of these children were white children. They were British children. Now, the purpose declared for this was for the child to become an adult with a trade. So as a child, we will send them to this workhouse, we'll send them to this training school, and they will develop a trade so that they can make a living for themselves and not mooch on society. If we fast forward to the 1800s, Charles Dickens' novel, Oliver Twist, highlights the failures of these institutions. But what is important to understand is that Dickens himself, as a child, was sent to a workhouse applying the labels to containers of boot black. Boot black is what they called black boot polish in those days. But it's important to understand that these were very horrific places. Dickens was traumatized by that. By the way, he was sent there because of his father's debts. Okay. Now, when we come to colonial America, it's important to understand that there was a high infant mortality rate, and this might have had a psychological impact on parents who may have subconsciously not bonded with their children in the same way that we do today. If one fears that they're going to lose their children before they become adults, it is easier for them psychologically if they don't bond in the same way. So it's important to understand. But during colonial America, the family was considered as the primary supervisor of the children. Remember, this was the case for the ancients as well. But it's also important to understand that Renaissance concepts began to take hold in America. The Enlightenment was in full swing. The founders of the U.S. saw the U.S. as an experiment in rationality and logic, understanding that nature or nature's God gives us certain unalienable rights. But they also believed that it was logical to understand these rights. But as a result of the Enlightenment, which really helped us get rid of slavery eventually, it took a while, but it helped us get there. But the Enlightenment started the ball rolling of understanding that just because human beings are different from different places doesn't mean that one is better than the other. So the Enlightenment really got the ball rolling with getting rid of this idea that some individuals are superior to others. So there was racial supremacy, but there was also class supremacy, genetic supremacy. For example, the royalty across the world believed that whatever God they believed in had made them better, that they had purer genetic material, even if they couldn't use those words. And so they were better than everyone else, and that's why they were the monarchs. But as we look at this, children went from being seen as possessions to young adults or young human beings in need of guidance and protection. So in colonial America, juvenile correction was administered by a mix of family, community, and church. And yes, the church could punish a child as well. all sorts of apocryphal stories about things that preachers did to children during worship services back in those days. Now, also, it's important to understand that as the U.S. Revolutionary War is happening, we're really in the beginning stages of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution begins to have an impact on juvenile justice in the U.S., as well as in Western Europe. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, important to understand this, a smaller percentage of the population lived close to cities. Now that's an important understanding when we're talking about juvenile justice, because juvenile delinquency became more of a city problem. So there were new issues for children and forced labor. Before the Industrial Revolution, the children helped out on the farm, but that labor wasn't the backbreaking kind of labor that industrial farms have, or that all the industries, the plants, the factories in the cities had. And subsistence wages forced adults and children to work. Now, what's interesting is that the Industrial Revolution also brought about this idea of conspicuous consumption. Now, there's always been conspicuous consumption. We can go back to ancient times. We might dig up an archaeological site and discover a civilization we never knew existed. And there will be people there that had all these gold things because they wanted other people to see how flashy they were. Okay. But conspicuous consumption is the idea that where we buy expensive items to display our wealth, not out of need. Okay. So materialism, in other words, became very, very important during the Industrial Revolution, and it's only gotten worse. Just watch the commercials. They appeal to your greed. They appeal to your desire to show other people how good you are because of how much money you have. Okay. We moved from an agrarian society to one of consumers and materialists. So rather than farming to feed ourselves, sharing with our neighbors when they needed, trading real goods with our neighbors instead of money for goods, in case there are needs that they have or that we have that they need. But anyway, so that became stronger during the Industrial Revolution. So adolescence as a stage of life truly began to develop, but the 1950s, post-World War II, is where we really began to fine-tune our study of adolescence, our understanding of adolescence as a separate stage of life. It was always there, but the Industrial Revolution and the consumerism really, really started to take hold even more strongly in the 1950s. It got a burst in the 1890s with the Chicago World's Fair called the Columbian Exhibition because of Columbus. And then it got another boost in the 1950s, post World War II, where the U.S. is helping Western Europe rebuild, and rock and roll is beginning to develop. But anyway, so we got rid of child labor laws by then, and adolescence as a stage of life just really began to take off in the 1950s. But anyway, so it's interesting to understand also that West Virginia plays a role in this, because the coal mine wars also helped to eradicate child labor. Now, the image that you see here are children in a textile mill. This is a colorized version of a very famous photograph from the early 1900s. But the coal mine wars also helped to eradicate child labor. So here you have two images from West Virginia coal mines. But what's interesting is that by the 1920s, when we started to look at the child labor laws, the city itself was blamed for the delinquent behavior of the children. It's not the children's fault, it's the city's fault. Well, we got the cities mostly because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, juvenile institutions were built far into the country in the early days of them in the US, and quite frankly, they still kind of are, as an attempt to leverage and instill traditional agrarian values. Because even those who lived in the city believed um, in the pure, simple life of the country. There's a back to the land movement amongst progressives, even today, that is occurring. It was interesting back in the 1970s. There was a British sitcom called The Good Neighbors about a guy that quit his job, and rather than moving out to the country, they tried to turn their suburban backyard into a farm. It was a comedy, obviously, but it was all about this very phenomenon. Now, some have argued that these institutions were simply a way of controlling the poor and training them to work in the factories. Um, by the way, the Child Savers, the book, Anthony Platt. When I say some, he's the leader of the pack. All right, so we are going to begin the next video with reforms by the U.S.